Please take your seats so we can begin our morning session. As we begin our morning session, we want to stop and give thanks for just a marvelous worship service. And the Reverend Dr. Rock Jones is still in the house. Rock, where are you? Can you express appreciation? He's over. Can you express appreciation? Stand up, Rock. So if any of you pastors are going on vacation and need somebody to preach for you while you're away, you might, Ohio Wesleyan, I think you can reach him or something. This morning session I've been looking to for a long time because it's kind of a leadership, a learning thing. You know, we've been talking about this strategic pyramid of aligning our resources of money, of capital, of human resources. And in order to do that, it's so that we can equip clergy and laity to do what we need to do in order to have vital congregations, so that we might make and mature disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. So what we want to do in this session is look, well, how do we recruit, train, equip, and support clergy, and how do we have lay people do more than just church work, if you know what I mean. Now, church work is important, but how do we have a missionary movement where lay people take the responsibility of their baptism and go out in the world and do the work of Christ wherever they live, wherever they work, wherever they play? So we've invited two speakers this morning that are going to talk about those two elements. We're going to start with the laity and have about an hour where we're going to have a conversation of how people get formed to follow Christ. Often starts early, and it involves other lay people and clergy that form us. So we're going to be talking about how Jesus calls us into community, and what are those factors that form us. And we're going to be dealing with reality of what happens with young people as they get formed today or not formed into followers of Jesus Christ. And then we're going to have a little brief interview and take a stretch break and do some singing. Then we're going to have another speaker come back who's going to talk about clergy and how we might do a better job of supporting clergy and what are some of the realities that we're facing. And then I'm going to interview both speakers, and we'll have probably a 15-20 minutes or so of kind of we'll see how it goes, and we may even let you ask some questions. Depending if it gets dry up here, we'll let you go to the mic and add to the conversation. That's what makes this place come alive. So this morning, our speaker that we have is the Reverend Dr. Kenda Creasy, Dean. Do any of you know her? She grew up in the East Ohio Conference, and we welcome her back this week. When I moved here in 2004, people kept talking about this CCYM. It sounded like some Soviet task force to me or something, just the way the letters were shaped. And I started learning about the Conference Council on Youth Ministry, and then I think I met Matt Lafferty, who was, I think, maybe the president at the time. And then I heard about this whole series of people who were, Barbara Yost was here one time, and she said I was the very first president. Is Barbara in the house today? I don't know where she is now, but she said she was the very first one. Well, our speaker, Kenda, was the third president of East Ohio's Conference Council on Youth Ministry. So I'm going to go on with this introduction, but before I do that, we were talking last night, and we don't know the full history of the early years. So if you were either the president or the vice president of the Conference Council on Ministries, when this program is over this morning, we want you to come down here, and we would like to get a picture of all of the presidents or former and vice presidents of the former CCYMs and sort of have a brief catching up how the story really happened. We'd appreciate that. Kenda grew up in the Delaware Grace United Methodist Church, and she was our CCYM president from 1976 to 77. And then she served as staff of the CCYM from 1981 to 1982. She's now an ordained minister of the Baltimore, Washington Annual Conference. She's an elder, and she serves as the Mary D. Sinite Professor of Youth, Church, and Culture at Princeton Theological Seminary, and as the coordinating pastor of Kingston United Methodist Church, which is an intergenerational congregation that is focusing on young adult ministry in a community with 54,000 college students. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree, magna cum laude, in education, and a Master of Arts degree in speech communication from Miami University in Ohio. She has a Master of Divinity degree from Wesley Theological Seminary and earned a PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary in 1997. While at Miami University, Dr. Dean was the national champion in persuasive speech and informative speaking, and she was the state champion in persuasive rhetorical criticism and extemporary speaking. She won't use any notes today. No, just kidding. When I read about that, I said, my, what a background she's had. In addition, she won over 120 awards in forensic competition and earned the Bernard Phelps Award for Outstanding Achievement. What we have here is just your typical East Ohio CCYM president, an overachiever who loves Jesus Christ. She's the author of numerous books on youth and the church, including Almost Christian, What the Faith of Our Teenagers is Telling the American Church, The Theological Turn in Youth Ministry with Andrew Root, The God-Bearing Life, The Art of Soul Tending for Youth Ministry with Ron Foster, and her current book, A More Excellent Way, How Youth Ministry is Reinventing Theological Education with Christy Lang Hurlson, is due out from Erdman's next fall. She has a statement on her website, and it says this, quote, Kenda hails from a long line of Ohio farmers and Kentucky coal miners. Although she herself is a PK, a politician's kid, at 15, this is on the website, at 15 she attended a United Methodist Church camp on Lake Erie that pretty much changed everything. Kenda and her husband Kevin are the parents of 2 young adults, and I've invited Cindy Patterson to close this introduction with something a little more personal because they've been friends for a long time. Cindy, you want to continue the introduction?
When Bishop Hopkins asked if I would help with the introduction of Kenda, his eyes twinkled and he said, the juicier the better. And then I thought about it and I thought, oh my gosh, anything juicy I share is going to implicate me as well. So Kenda can go back to Princeton, but I have to stay in East Ohio, so some stories are better left unsaid. Kenda Creasy, I met her in this place 38 years ago when she was the newly elected, enthusiastic, wait a minute, that's not right, effervescent, newly elected CCYM president. And she led a group of kids who thought we were just arrogant enough to think that we could change the world for Jesus. And we were surrounded by a group of adults who didn't tell us any differently. In fact, they encouraged us in that belief that we could change the world. And they raised us up that way. Kenda and I's path our lives have been intertwined ever since, sometimes loosely, sometimes more tightly. When we were college students, the two of us, as well as Kenda's future husband, worked together on the Harrison County Youth Service Project, lovingly known as Hickey Sip. And I'm not sure about for Kenda, but I suspect that was one of those places where we both heard the whisper of our call into ministry as we were young and thrust into leadership within the conference. Our journey has continued throughout. The most recent adventure we've shared together was as OWU moms, as my daughter Kenda and her daughter Shannon have been students together at Ohio Wesleyan, and they have forged their own friendship as the circle of life continues. It's been such a blessing for us. I could go on, but I'm not going to because you want to hear from her. I am so honored to help to introduce Kenda Creasy Dean, who is one of the most passionate, inspired, and inspiring leaders of our time. And you will be so blessed this morning by the words that she brings us. Welcome, Kenda.
It's overwhelming to be home. So pray with me if you would. Gracious God, please take over here. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. It is amazing to be here. The last time I was here was for a youth annual conference in 2000, which was like 14 years ago, and Lakeside is like a different place. It was the whole place has gotten a facelift, and all these fleets of golf carts everywhere, and a few things are the same. I had forgotten what a mayfly was until I got back here. The dumbest bugs ever. They don't move, you know? They just live in your clothes and stuff. Hilltop House is still standing. That's astonishing for those of you who have ever stayed there. But we are really uptown now, which is kind of fun. Anyway, I heard that this weekend, Youth Annual Conference had 962 people. That is unbelievable. And I wonder if any of you have ever been part of a Youth Annual Conference, ever. Would you just stand right now? I hope you'll look around at the support that you have given youth ministry throughout your time in this conference. Go ahead and sit down. You may not know that East Ohio Conference sponsored the first youth annual conference in the United States in 1975. For many years, it was the only youth annual conference that took young people seriously enough to encourage them to bring legislation to the annual conference floor. It was the only conference for a long time that elected youth as delegates to general conference, and you pioneered all that. I wonder if those of you who have ever been part of a conference camp, or a mission project, either as a camper or a participant or a staff member, would you guys stand? Again, look around at the influence that youth ministry has had on this body. Thank you. You can sit down. This summer, 11 million young people will go to camp. About 3/4 of those will go to camp in a religious camp or a nonprofit setting. Wayne Meisel, writing in the Huffington Post last week, called church camps farm teams for church leadership. I think he is exactly right, but that's probably because I was on one of those farm teams once. And listen, I am so aware that there are 500 people in this room who could say this same story, but my version of it goes like this. I would not be in ministry if it were not for the United Methodist women at my home church, Grace Church in Delaware, who sent me to camp when I was 15. Specifically, they sent me here to Lakeside Reach Out. I was astonished to discover it's still going on. And full disclosure, I came to Reach Out to get a tan. But I left with a sense of purpose that almost 40 years later, I have not been able to shake. Reach Out was the first place it occurred to me that it wasn't so much that I believed in Jesus. The point might be that Jesus believed in me. And through Reach Out, I wound up having one blessing after another blessing after another blessing. You know how God does. You know, you give God an inch and God takes a mile. And through Reach Out, I wound up on CCYM, and through CCYM, I wound up on Harrison County Youth Service Project staff, and through that, I wound up in ministry. And I know how many people here this morning have a story that sounds a lot like that. We had no idea at that time that we were participating in this great bucket brigade of faith. That there were these adults in this conference who were handing their bucket of faith down the line to us. And now here we are, needing to hand ours on to someone else. I'm so honored and so humbled to be here right now. I speak at annual conferences a lot, and this is the hardest one. Because everything I can think of to say thank you sounds so trite. Those of us who grew up in the ministries of this conference were privileged for this reason. We worked alongside adults who gave us primary leadership experience, who had a really high tolerance for harebrained teenage ideas, and who actually encouraged this arrogance that Cindy talked about so that we would dream and scheme to change the world for Jesus. And when I was on CCYM, Youth Annual Conference was one of those ideas. We were like, I don't know if this will work. Let's give it a shot. We were allowed to fail. Sometimes those failures were our doing. At other times, they just happened. You might remember, some of you, the year at Cedar Point, the youth of East Ohio Conference literally brought down the house, right? The ballroom collapsed at Cedar Point under the weight of 3,000 teenagers taking communion in the middle of an amusement park. This week, Ray Tucker reminded me of something that I didn't know about that day. He said the Holy Spirit was on the loose in ways we didn't realize. This is a newspaper article about that. He said the Holy Spirit was on the loose because there was a gas main that should have snapped when that building broke. It held fast, but if it had broken, the whole place would have gone up in flames. Today, my day job is teaching youth ministry and young adult ministry to seminarians and to researching the situation of American young people in the church. But I'm here to tell you, I learned youth ministry from East Ohio Conference. And I pour hope into my students the way you poured hope into me. And now comes the problem, because Bishop Hopkins asked me to talk about what forms young people in faith, and then how I was formed in faith here. And you know, we're talking like a semester-long class. So we're going to try to keep it shorter than that. But those of you who are CCYM people who are headed for camp staffs this summer, just 2 words for you: buckle up. Because here are 6 principles about youth ministry that you're about to learn from the East Ohio Conference. And I think they might just change the church. Principle number 1. The goal of youth ministry is not to save the church. Now, you've heard this 100 times, right? The church is dying. We need young people to save it. Let's get the theology straight first. Young people do not save the church. Only Jesus Christ saves the church, okay? But it's very common. It's very common to think about youth as targets of ministry, right? Objects of ministry, vehicles for our ministry, rather than as agents of ministry that God has called in their own right. I call this vampire theology, right? So here's what happens with vampire theology, okay? You see young people coming through the door of the church, and you don't think, wow, here are some people, I wonder how they're called by God to serve God in this place. No, what we see is young blood that we need to survive, right? And then we proceed to suck the life right out of them. And what happens when we do that, right? We are using young people for our own institutional self-preservation. Nobody wants to be used. And what happens is the goal here is all tangled up. But the goal of youth ministry is not to save the church. It's to experience and participate in God's transformation. And so I want you to try this with me. It's an exercise in hermeneutics, which is a $10 word for a 10-cent concept. Just hang with me. Okay, here's what you're going to do. Pretend there is a clock stuck on the ceiling of Hoover Auditorium, and take your index finger and trace the outside of that clock going clockwise. That's to the right, by the way. Okay. Okay, trace the outside of that clock going clockwise, and just keep doing that. Don't change anything. Keep going around the outside of the clock, but slowly bring your finger down beneath your nose. Okay? Now which way is your finger going? Counterclockwise. It's a miracle. Yeah, you can do it again, all right? It'll make you happy, all right? Outside of the clock, going to the right. Slowly bring it down beneath your nose. And now your finger's going the other direction. Why is that? What changed? Your perspective, your point of view. This is what hermeneutics is, right? It's your interpretive perspective. What you see is determined by where you sit. That's what hermeneutics means. And so the goal of youth ministry is to help young people experience this kind of transformation so that they begin to see their lives not from their point of view, but from God's side of the clock. And of course, when that happens, often the facts of their lives don't change very much. But boy, the reality is entirely different. The problem is that now we have research that is telling us with astonishing and disturbing consistency that most of what we're doing in the name of youth ministry and Christian formation is not accomplishing this kind of transformation in young people's lives. In fact, most of what we're doing in youth ministry isn't changing much of anything at all. As it turns out, what we mostly do in youth ministry is try to perpetuate who we already are, and that means that youth ministry looks a whole lot like this PlayStation 2 commercial. Okay, watch this. Go. Now, can you go back to so that we get the volume from the beginning?
Training fleas requires a glass jar with a lid. The fleas are placed inside the jar and the lid is then sealed. They are left undisturbed for 3 days. Then, when the jar is opened, the fleas will not jump out. In fact, the fleas will never jump higher than the level set by the lid. Their behavior is now set for the rest of their lives. And when these fleas reproduce, their offspring will automatically follow their example.
Okay, that's a little disturbing, right? So here's the question to take home to your congregation, right? Does your church expect youth ministry to train fleas? If so, this business of transformation is never going to happen because we're too busy trying to keep the fleas in our jar. Principle number 2. Youth ministry is youth ministry, right? The most effective formation for the Christian life is the Christian life. The most effective way to prepare people for ministry is to let them do ministry. This has been a hallmark of East Ohio's youth ministry from the get-go. Adults are present to give structure and support, but youth lead youth. At the 3rd Youth Annual Conference, we held this youth rally at Cedar Point, something we did in those days. And what happened was the speaker got tied up in traffic and never made it. So there were five or six of us backstage getting ready to, waiting to introduce the speaker. We were CCYM kids because, again, the kids are the ones up front and we were the ones introducing the speaker. But there were 500 teenagers on benches in front at the Cedar Point Frontierland Amphitheater, and they were waiting and waiting and waiting and getting more restless and restless and restless, and still no speaker. And so Ray Tucker, and if you remember Ray Tucker, you will imagine how bluntly he said this. He was then the conference staff person for youth ministry. He turned to me and said, "Well, you're the president, get out there." So, I don't remember much of what I did. I prayed, I must have said something. I led a few songs, and for any of you who might have been there, I apologize for that. I knew about 5 chords to this professional guy's 200, But it never occurred to me that adults would save the day. It was a youth rally. And in East Ohio, youth ministry meant youth's ministry. It was ours to lead. Daunting? Absolutely. Empowering? You bet. It wasn't until I was ordained and a pastor in another conference that I realized that not every conference approaches youth ministry this way. I was staffing a camp, and it was it was a great camp, but something felt off about it, and about halfway through the week, it dawned on me that the adults did everything for the planning, the execution. They did it all, and the kids were passive consumers of everything that happened at this camp. And the adults who planned and executed this camp were really into it. The kids, not so much. Principle number 3. The bucket brigade of faith starts with adults. One of the strongest findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion, which is a research project I was involved in for about 10 years, is that young people mirror the faith of their parents to an astonishing degree. We basically get what we are. Young people will mirror the faith of the adults who love them. That sounds great until you realize what shape most parents' faith is in. The single most important investment a congregation can make in the faith of young people is to invest in the faith of the adults who love them. You can't give what you don't have. You got to put your own oxygen mask on first. Pick your metaphor. But if we want youth to be serious about their faith, then we have to get serious about ours. In fact, next to religious experience, the most powerful predictor on whether a young person's faith will continue into young adulthood is if his or her parents were religiously devoted and active while he or she was in high school. Parents never believe that. They're like, my kid doesn't listen to a thing that I say. Maybe not, but they're watching everything that you do. And if they don't see us practice faith as adults, then they will only think that faith is an extracurricular activity. It was a nice thing I did while I was in high school. I'm glad I did it. It made me more well-rounded. But I don't see any adults doing this. It must be something I leave behind when I graduate. There's no getting around it. If we want our children to have faith, first we must attend to our own. For the vast majority of those of us who were involved in East Ohio Conference Youth Ministries and who experienced them as transformative, the scaffolding for that transformation was laid by our parents and by our congregations back home. Many of you know about the National Study of Youth and Religion. It's the largest study of youth and faith that, as far as we know, that's ever been done. It involved extensive interviews with about 3,300 teenagers and their parents, and it's still going on. It goes every 5 years. They go back to the same group of people to find out how their faith has changed as they get older. The significance of the National Study of Youth and Religion isn't what they found out about teenagers. Nothing they found out is going to surprise anybody who works with a kid. The significance is that it reframes the problems that we have blamed on youth ministry as the problems facing the church. In addition to the findings about parents, here are 4 other findings that describe the faith of most American young people today. First, teenagers are not hostile to religion. That surprised the sociologists in the study because they expected to find a lot of tension and arguments and so on about religion at homes, but the fact is that was not true. That's the good news. The bad news is why teenagers are not hostile about religion. Why aren't they hostile? Because they don't care. You only fight about things that you care about, right? So Christian Smith, who is the lead researcher on this project, made this comment that most churches' primary central problem is not teen rebellion, but teenagers' benign whateverism. Okay? Second finding, teenagers are incredibly inarticulate about their faith. There's almost a total lack of theological language among American teenagers. They knew one theological word. You want to guess what it was? God. They could say God, and they could often say it without swearing. One of the biggest problems they had, you could probably guess this, the biggest problem they had talking about was Jesus. Absolutely shut down. We would watch kids, like they couldn't get it out of their mouth. Turns out that mainline Protestant kids, our kids, were the least religiously articulate of all of the groups that we studied. They had the most trouble talking about Jesus in particular. They were very articulate about everything else. I mean, people say, well, yeah, teenagers, they just grunt anyway. How do you expect them to be articulate about their faith? But if you work with teenagers, you know that's not true. Very articulate about a range of subjects, especially stuff that they studied in school. But when it came to Jesus, they just shut down. What that told us was they just aren't spending much time in communities that use the word Jesus. There were exceptions, usually Mormons, conservative Protestants, and black Protestants. But on the whole, this was a finding that was everywhere. The next finding was that a minority of American young people do think religion is important. They say they want to continue it with their own children. About 40% fall in this category. But when we pushed this statistic, what we found was that only 8%, that's about 1 in 12, fell in the category of highly devoted young people. Highly devoted meant you went to church most weeks, you were involved in something outside of worship. You would go to worship and maybe choir or Sunday school or something like that. You would pray or read the Bible on your own sometimes without being told. You would try to integrate your faith into the way you related to people. In other words, the bar's not real high. This is pretty much what we want. And every time I talk to pastors about this, I get pushback because they're like, only 8%, that can't be right, because I've got all of these kids in my congregation that do all of that stuff. Yeah, that's right, because these are the kids that we see. It turns out that we're pretty good as congregations in addressing the 8% of young people who are already highly devoted. It's that other 92% we have trouble with. Churches dispute that. But the most significant finding, and this is the one that I've spent most of my own research time on, is that most teenagers, 60%, find religion inconsequential. It's fine. You know, just it really doesn't matter that much. It's okay if you need it. I just don't need it, you know. But it's not that they don't have a common faith. They do. And what the researchers wound up calling this common creed among American teenagers was moralistic therapeutic deism. I know. And if you just sum it up, here's what moralistic therapeutic deism is. God helps you be nice. God helps you feel good about yourself. And otherwise, God pretty much stays out of the way. Okay. 5 tenets to moralistic therapeutic deism. You just saw the first one. Here's what you believe if you're a moralistic therapeutic deist. 1, God exists and created and ordered over the world and life on earth. 2, God wants people to feel good about themselves and to be good and nice and fair to each other as taught by the Bible and most world religions. 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about yourself. 4, God doesn't need to be involved in my life except when I need God to solve a problem. They were not real complimentary on God's job performance on that, by the way. And 5, good people, like good dogs, go to heaven when they die. There's a summary slide coming up next. This is the default religion of American teenagers. And it looks, go ahead to the next slide, would you? Because it looks kind of Christian-ish on the outside. I don't know if you can see all that. But here's how we're going to test it. We're going to say the Apostles' Creed together. We're not going to go all the way through it. I'm going to stop you halfway. And I've got crib notes for you. I don't know if you can read them from the back, but we'll give it a shot. So go ahead to the next slide, and let's say the Apostles' Creed together, okay? All right. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. Okay, we're going to stop there. I work with Presbyterians, and Jesus goes to hell with them. But for us, he tends to go straight on. I sometimes remind them of that. Anyway, all right, so just think for a second. What are the differences between what you saw in moralistic therapeutic deism and the Apostles' Creed that we just said? Okay? I mean, we hear, this room is too big to have a discussion, sorry. But, you know, we hear things like, yeah, well, okay, the Apostles' Creed has Jesus in it. The Apostles' Creed has suffering in it. The Apostles' Creed, here's the big one. Who's the Apostles' Creed about? God. Who is moralistic therapeutic deism about? Us, right. So we have somehow allowed this self-serving spirituality to kind of infiltrate and masquerade as Christianity. And here's the kicker. The sociologists on the study are not willing to leave moralistic therapeutic deism to teenagers, right? Because remember, whose faith does teenage faith look like? Their parents and the adults around them, right? And because they mirror their parents' religious lives so closely, Christian Smith and other sociologists put it this way, this is a quote, moralistic therapeutic deism is now the dominant religion in the United States, having supplanted Christianity in American churches. Wow. In other words, young people do not practice moralistic therapeutic deism because they've misunderstood what we've taught them in church, right? They practice it because this is what we've taught them in church. So here's the next question you can take back to your congregations. It'll really mess them up, right? But ask, go through all this and say, has this church been colonized by moralistic therapeutic deism? Do we think that matters? The National Study of Youth and Religion, as I mentioned, is still going on. The 13-year-olds that I studied 10 years ago obviously are now out of college. And the thing is, as a society, we've sort of gotten used to moralistic therapeutic deism. For example, here's a church sign. Go ahead and, yeah, do something nice for someone. I'm like, really? Is that the best we can come up with? You might not be able to see the Hispanic congregation, what their title is, Christ is Alive. So as a result, more young people as they get older are just coming to realize, wait a second, if this is what the church teaches, and I can be nice and I can feel good about myself outside of the church, why do I need to even pretend? And so this is what the sociologists who at the Pew Foundation identify as the nuns, not her, but N-O-N-E-S, right? People, when you ask them what their religious faith is, they just check none. More young people than ever before, since sociologists have started measuring this, are now considering themselves in this category. You've heard of this. You know, for example, that nuns are the fastest growing religious group in the United States, right? 1 in 5, actually that number is a little higher now. It's growing fastest, though, among young adults, 18 to 26-year-olds, 1 in 3. More young adults identify as being a nun than identify as being a mainline Protestant or an evangelical Protestant. Most nuns were raised in religious homes, and 2/3 of them were Christian. So, in other words, these are not other people's kids. These are our kids. These are the kids we read Bible stories to and bring to youth group and pour ourselves into. They're not somebody else's kids. And here, this is the last one that's important. Most nuns are not agnostic or atheist. That number's pretty stable. Most are just nothing in particular. And I want to be clear, I don't see this as a movement of apostasy among American young people. I see it as a bunch of young adults trying to get honest. I mean, I think the fact is we've had nuns in our pews for a long time. It's just taken a while for us to be able to get honest about that. After all, they don't hate religious people. They grew up in churches, a lot of them. If you ask them, many of them would say, I wish I believed in this stuff. It's just that if I'm honest, I don't. Well, it would be great, of course, if these young people came to our churches, though Jesus never asked people to go to church. But first, they need a community of people who will come alongside them before they will come alongside us. Principle number 5. Youth ministry is not the youth group. There's nothing wrong with a youth group as long as we remember 2 things about it. First, it's one of dozens of forms of youth ministry. There's no right form of youth ministry. A choir is a form of youth ministry. So is volunteering to be part of Vacation Bible School. So is being on a team that visits shut-ins. So is being in an intergenerational woodworking group. So is supporting the teachers in your local school who identify struggling students that you help as a congregation. I mention all of those as forms of youth ministry because they're what my congregation of 80 people does as youth ministry when we only have one teenager who comes to church. Kay Wolfinger told me yesterday that there in the East Ohio Conference, 70% of churches in this conference report having no teenagers. That's an astonishing statistic. But hear me say this, that does not mean you do not have a youth ministry. There is a community out there with people in it trying to love their children, and they need us to come alongside them in that. We talked at lunch yesterday with youth ministers, or 2 days ago, that youth ministry happens through things like landscaping businesses and food trucks and coffee shops that churches support. I know of 2 youth ministries that have knocked out their entire youth budget, and they've converted the youth budget into microloans that they give to teenagers to start ministries in their communities. And the deal is, those kids have to figure out a way to earn back enough money to repay the loan so that somebody can get it next year. They run like nonprofits. So youth groups are one form of youth ministry, but not the only form, not even the primary form, and in a lot of ways, not even the best form. Regardless of the size of your congregation, the best youth ministry you will ever have, if you do it well, is worship. Because in worship, you touch people who are in ministry to young people you will never see. There was a study done in Australia that traced kids for 10 years, 2 different groups, kids that went to worship but weren't involved in a youth group, and kids that went to a youth group and weren't involved in worship. 10 years later, who was still involved in church? The kids that went to worship. Youth groups do a lot of good things for young people, but it turns out they're not very good at supporting faith. The 3 fastest growing denominations in terms of young people, just so you know, are Pentecostals, okay? Eastern Orthodox, it's not because of the contemporary worship, by the way. And ready for the last one? The Amish. Now look, there's only 250,000 Amish in America. They're not taking over anytime soon. But you know what the retention rate of being Amish is? About 95%. You know, there's no confirmation class that has a statistic close to that. And there are lots of reasons for that. But one of the things, there are certain things that these cultures have in common. They are high expectation cultures. They have high expectations for participation. They have high expectations for embodiment. You don't just sit there and do faith from the neck up. They have high expectations for intensive community. So if not the youth group, what do we do? Well, here I'm borrowing from Drew Dyson's dissertation, who studied United Methodist churches who do a good job of addressing young people who've experienced faith drift. In other words, they started out in the church and wound up outside of it. The churches that do a good job of bringing these young people back to faith have high expectations in three ways. High expectations for meaning. In contrast to a culture of trivialization, when these Christians gather, they deal with stuff that matters, what makes a difference in people's lives. That's why service is so important to this generation of young people. That's why theology matters. What am I for? What's worth living for? What's worth dying for? That's why worship has to have magnitude. It has to be about a God who makes a difference and not just a God who just sits there. So Maria Dixon Hall says that the most effective way to hand on faith to millennials is through the personal testimony of religious experience. Tell me how God is meaningful to you. The second way these cultures have high expectations is they have high expectations for belonging. Not just attending, belonging. Churches struggle with this, right? We're usually just happy if a young person shows up. We don't want to scare youth away by expecting a lot of them. And this is the kind of thing that led Jon Stewart. You know who Jon Stewart is? He's the guy that does The Daily Show. It's one of these late night talk shows. It's a comedy show. It's the #1 source of news for young adults. Anyway, he said, the United Methodist Church is the University of Phoenix of religions. Yeah. Now that Barb was not at the University of Phoenix, right? That was at us. What he meant was that the United Methodist Church is a low expectation culture. It's easy in, it's easy out. We don't want to inconvenience you by asking too much of you. There's nothing upside down about us. Belonging requires churches to invite young people to participate in resurrection and not just consume it, to make them agents of mission and not objects of it, to have a load-bearing role to play in the faith community where it matters if I show up and something is missing if I'm gone. That's what it means to belong. Third, these congregations have high expectations for hospitality. It has to be radical hospitality, according to Drew. In other words, what young people are saying as they come in is, will this community judge me? Will this community judge my friends? Do I have to pretend to be somebody I'm not while I'm here? Is this a church that I'm not embarrassed to invite my friends to? Now, of course, all of these virtues could be communicated through a youth group, but the fact is no one-size ministry fits all for any of us. And if one expression of youth ministry isn't working in your context, quit it and do something else. Finally, the last principle. Being a young church is not about age. It's about hope. The thing is, being a young church really doesn't require us to have more young people. It requires us to have more hope, and the rest will take care of itself. There's a theologian named Jürgen Moltmann who argues that what makes youth young is not their age. What makes youth young, he says, is their wide open sense of possibility. Their confidence that they're not dying, that the church is not dying. In fact, their confidence that death is nowhere near them, that death is not on the horizon, that the future is unbounded and filled with unlimited potential. And you know, if kids are so hurt that they don't have this perspective, we say things like, well, they're old before their time. In the National Study of Youth and Religion, the kids who were highly devoted had vastly higher levels of hope than anyone else in the study. You see, for Christians, this wide open sense of possibility, this confidence that death is not a threat to us, this conviction that the future is a gift, this hope that the future is filled with potential, that is God's promise to everyone whose future is bound to Jesus Christ, no matter what our age may be. Because in Jesus Christ, we are people unfettered by death. In Moltmann's words, he says it this way: it's not that the future belongs to the young, the future makes us young. He tells a story in August 2002 of Pope John Paul II, who you might not know started out as a youth minister. He was very ill at this point and in a lot of pain, and he visited his hometown of Krakow. And the kids greeted him in throngs, and they started dancing around him and saying, "You are young, you are young." And he was like, "Oh, no, no, no." But they were right. And then they quoted this: "Youth shall faint and be weary. Young men shall fall exhausted, but they who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." This is how the Bucket Brigade of Faith begins. For me, it looked like Bishop James Thomas sitting beside me at Youth Annual Conference, praying for the youth of the conference, and then whispering Robert's Rules of Order in my ear. For me, it looked like Roger Skellywatts walking me around Lakeside for about 1,000 laps when I was in college, until he finally put into words what I didn't have the guts to say myself, and that is that I think God's calling you into ministry. For me, it looked like an ordination service on this stage, a lot like the one we had last night, except that I had such a spectacular case of stomach flu that my most memorable ordination present from Cindy was a bottle of Pepto-Bismol. My experience as a youth in this annual conference was that this place was a womb that nurtured high hopes and wild ideas, and adults like John McLaughlin and Ray Tucker and Paul White and Nancy Dolvin and Jean Lours and Amy Shaw and dozens of others. You somehow brought every harebrained idea that we had to life. And I guess it was because nothing was impossible with God, but it sure helped to have a bunch of adults who were sold out on teenagers. Today, every time I take a young person on a long walk around a camp or a conference center or a seminary campus, I hope I am channeling you, because now I'm the one looking for the opening to say, you know, I think God might be calling you to ministry. It's not rocket science, really. East Ohio Conference lets teenagers rub shoulders with people who make the Christian life, who make even Christian ministry look like a blast, in spite of the way ministry will break your heart. Barbara Wheeler's research on who goes to seminary found that young people will pursue careers in law and medicine even if they don't know a lawyer or a doctor, because they see on TV images of what these people do and what it looks like to live that kind of life. And so they will go into these professions with that as their only role model. But that's not true for clergy. Almost no one goes to seminary who doesn't have a personal relationship with someone in ministry. For those of us growing up in this conference, if we had any advantage over any other conference in youth ministry, it was you. If we have carried faith any further in this Bucket Brigade of Faith, it's only because you handed your bucket to us. This story sums it up for me. Ray Tucker and John McLaughlin supervised CCYM in the late 1970s when I was part of that group, and they basically thought it was their job to let us sort of run things, and they would sort of stand in the back of the room just in case things went off the rails. It just never occurred to us that youth ministry was something that grown-ups did to us. We were completely convinced that we were there doing the ministry for each other and for the world. And Reverend John, which we called him, and Ray, basically tried to make sure this was true. When I became a youth minister myself, I used to joke with Reverend John that he taught me everything I know about youth ministry, which is pretty much true. And 3 summers ago, Reverend John called me out of the blue. We hadn't talked for several years. He had just returned from his granddaughter Rachel's graduation in Seattle. John and Sandy had driven all the way from Ohio to Seattle in their RV. And when they went to church that Sunday, Rachel had been excited to introduce John to her youth pastor because he had been such an important figure in her life. And so when Reverend John met her youth pastor, his name was DJ, he discovered that DJ had graduated from Princeton Seminary, where I teach. And so he asked DJ if he knew me. And DJ laughed and jokingly said something like, "Well, sure, she taught me everything I know about youth ministry." And then Reverend John said his knees buckled. Because in that moment, it was suddenly clear to him that his decision 40 years earlier to work with a bunch of teenagers 2,000 miles away, 2 generations earlier, with a bunch of kids he probably thought he'd never see again, through that decision, he had actually helped his own granddaughter come to faith. It's mind-blowing. We can't see where this bucket brigade of faith is going to lead. We can only see the next person beside us that needs us to pass our bucket on to them. I happened to catch Reverend John's bucket, and then I passed it to DJ, and he passed it to Rachel, who passed it back to Reverend John. This great bucket brigade of faith, you're part of it, I'm part of it. Last summer, Reverend John and Sandy came to meet me. We were together in a New Jersey beach town, and we walked on the boardwalk on the beach, and we remembered 40 years of hope and doubt as we both tried to go out in the world and make disciples for Jesus Christ. We talked about the youth we found. We talked about youth we lost. We talked about people we forgave. We talked about people who we hope will one day forgive us. I don't know how many buckets of faith Reverend John passed down the line in his ministry. All that mattered to me was that I got one of them. Every one of us is here this morning because somebody passed a bucket of faith to us. And every one of us has somebody beside us who needs us to hand it on to them. Who is that for you? Who gave you their bucket of faith? Who's standing there waiting for you to pass yours along to them? Here is the good news. If the church is experiencing contractions, it's not because we're dying. It's because every new birth requires them. Being in transition bothers us a lot, but it doesn't scare Jesus, and it doesn't stop the bucket brigade of faith from continuing. Here's one last image I'd like to leave you with. It says more than I can about why we're in this together. It started out as a Super Bowl commercial. Watch.
This man right here is my great-grandfather. He was the first cat herder in our family.
Herding cats. Don't let anybody tell you it's easy.
Anybody can herd cattle. Holding together 10,000 half-wild short hairs, well, that's another thing altogether.
Being a cat herder is probably about the toughest thing I think I've ever done.
I got this one this morning, right here, and if you look at his face, it's just ripped to shreds, you know?
You see the movies, you hear the stories, I'm living a dream. Not everyone can do what we do.
I wouldn't do nothing else.
It ain't an easy job, but when you bring a herd into town and you ain't lost a one of them, ain't a feeling like it in the world.
Wow. How many would you vote for Kenda for president? I started it right here. You know, John Stewart was wrong when he compared the United Methodist Church and the University of Phoenix. You actually have to pay to go to the University of Phoenix. Wow. I told her we'd have a short dialogue here, and then we're going to have a singing break. But in the spirit of what you said about not doing things for people, I'm going to take 5 questions from the audience. But they have to be questions. If you start making a comment or talking about some CCYM experience, I'm going to cut you off. Okay, we're going to take 5 questions from the audience. So think about it. If you've got a very good, clear question to Kenda, not to me, I'm going to let you ask it a little bit.
6.
I assume the microphones will be on in a minute. Okay, but I'm going to ask the first one.
6.
Microphone 6. Well, don't open the mic yet, because I've got the first question.
He told me before we started, he said, remember, I'm in charge here.
That was for later when Bishop Huey's here, because she thinks she's in charge when I'm with her. I don't know how many years ago, Robert Bell and Associates wrote a book called Habits of the Heart. And it was a seminal book for me because he said that the one value that's been increasing in the U.S. society has been the rise of individualism.
Right.
And when we went from Christianity to this moral deistic theology, we went from a community faith where we're accountable and we learned our story in a community to a society that was mobile, families were broken up, and we became individualistic. And a lot of people are trying to become followers of Jesus as individuals. We model that as pastors. We model it in congregations. How do cultural changes affect what we're doing? I mean, can you come? Because until we live in community and people see our parents being part of an accountable community, it's hard to come to faith. So what's a parent to do? I mean, how can parents be accountable? Now, obviously, if you've got an intact family and you go to worship and you actually do mission work and you actually have Sunday and you actually pray and come home and talk about Jesus, your responsibility to Jesus where you work, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But we're an individualistic society.
Yeah, I mean, the moralistic therapeutic deism has been compared to civil religion. So you're correct that that's part of an individualistic response that we just sort of absorb in our culture around us. Here's where I think teenagers can teach us something. You know, one of the highest value almost among any group of teenagers is friendship, right? Teenagers know what it means to be in a community together. They know what it means to have each other's back. They know what it means to be able to, in their community, this is important. Their community is not just face-to-face, right? Used to be, they call it networked individualism now. And because it used to be that your community was, geographic, and then it was someplace you could drive to, and now it's whoever's in your phone, right? But kids still value the face-to-face community that they have with their friends. And churches can take a page from that book in terms of doing ministry out of friendship instead of just out of the, here we are because we're the church together. I think that churches are less bound by friendship than they would like to think, Most of us come because we're part of the same community, but are we actually friends in that community? Do we actually do things together out of that relationship? I would start with that. But friendship is something that is also changing because of the technology, so it's not a magic bullet.
So part of us have children or grandchildren. If you want to pass that faith on, we've got to model accountable community and real fellowship, not just be individual and pass on our individual faith, but model it in a community. Microphone number 6, is it? I don't see anybody at 6. It must be 5. Microphone number 5.
Am I on? No? Hello?
Is it open? Microphone 5 open?
Is it on? Hello? Okay.
It's not on.
Go ahead and try
So
it.
this question has a little bit to do with worship wars, but I'd love it to maybe expand. I see how different elements in worship and different expressions of ministry and faith, some come from more of the left brain, some come from more of the right brain in the way that people express themselves. Is there a generational difference, or do you see a generational movement, particularly with young people? Are they using more of the right side of their brain or left side of the brain, and how does that affect the way that we express our faith and express ourselves to God in worship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tend to think about that in terms of styles, right? Left brain style, right brain style, I guess. I think the real issue is not style or left brain, right brain, but participation. Are we able to participate? Are we able to bring what we have to offer to the altar? Are we able to be part of this as opposed to just sit here and consume it? And it turns out that young people you heard the statistics on Eastern Orthodox faith, in terms of growing youth populations. So the style of worship seems to be less important than whether they understand that they are participants and whether they are able to have a sense that God is there. Does it matter? Does it have any magnitude to it? If it is not significant, you can sing all the praise songs you want, but it's not going to make any difference. By the way, this is something that will get me, I'm leaving town soon, so I can just say this, but this always makes people crazy to know this, but what we know from the data is that contemporary Christian music is not, don't add a praise band if that's what you think is going to bring young people. Who's going to come if you have a praise band? Boomers. People my age like contemporary music. The exception to that is if you've had a significant experience, like you've been at camp and you've sung some songs, then you like those. Or if you play in the band, then you're all in. But other than that, most millennials will tell you that they think Christian contemporary stuff is cheesy. And their parents, however, love it. So,
microphone number 3.
I'm curious about how you blend hospitality to young people overall in the congregation while also holding high expectation for them. So I don't know if you have ideas for us as committee leaders that want a young person on our committee. We want them to feel welcome, but we also want them to be accountable. Can you speak a little bit to blending hospitality and accountability?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, this is the big question about how do you have identity but still be open to all people, right? And part of what I think we've gotten used to thinking about high expectations as there's a certain bar you have to meet before you're in the community, right? And if you meet these expectations, then we let you in. I think we might be in a place where we are beginning to flip that. It's easy to get in, it's harder to stay. I was in Africa and somebody described it this way. They said, you Christians are always worried about who's in and who's out. And they said, in Africa, we think about Christianity as a farm. And the issue is not whether you're in the farm or out of the farm, because there are no fences around the farm. The issue is whether you're moving towards the farm or away from the farm. And so the image in terms of identity is one of magnetic pull rather than one of fences that you have to somehow reach a bar to get over. But that's a great question in terms of how we balance those two things.
Microphone number 7.
Dr. Kendra, what would you identify as maybe some of the biggest barriers or obstacles that would be preventing youth from experiencing and becoming integrated into genuine, faith-based Christian community where it is happening? What are the barriers that keeps that community from reaching out to youth, and what are the barriers that keep youth from experiencing that community where it's happening?
God can overcome any barrier, right? So these are just things that the data might tell you, understanding that there are lots of exceptions to these. First barrier is parents, If parents don't take faith seriously, kids will not take faith seriously. It's rather, it happens, right? But it's kind of unusual. The second is if parents, lots of young people don't come from religious homes. So what we know is that congregations can kind of fill in and become spiritual parents for these kids, if that's the case. But congregations often don't know how to do that. And related to that is the fact that there's a whole generation, we talked about this at the youth leader lunch, there's a whole generation of parents out there whose own religious formation is pretty sketchy, right? So they don't know, they would like for their young people for their children to have religion, but they don't have clue one how to get it to them, so they bring them to church to get them done by the professionals, okay? And so part of it is, the longer I'm in this research, I really think our first job is with the adults in our community. And here's an interesting sidebar. I can count a dozen times this has happened in the last 5 or 6 years, where many of the people who graduate from Princeton Seminary go into large churches, so they still have staff, right? They'll go into a youth pastor position. Within about 5 years, the congregation comes to them and says, hey, I want you to do for the adults what you're doing for our kids, What they're saying is we want the quality of relationships that we see in our young people. We want the kind of, purpose and outreach that we see our young people enacting on our behalf. They're seeing the kind of meaning and belonging and radical hospitality being enacted within the circle of youth ministry, but they feel like it's missing in the broader congregation. So these pastors are now taking their cues from youth ministry and trying to transfer it on to the larger congregation. I don't even know if that answered your question, but there you go.
Well, essentially, we had Dr. Scott Morris here from Memphis Church Health Center a couple of years ago, And he said one thing happened. Our society is used to giving things over to professionals. Like we gave health over to medicine.
Yeah.
And we gave education over to schooling. And in many ways, the church has given over taking the faith to professionals. You bring people and they do it. And what Scott said, no, we need to reclaim health is more than medicine. Education is more than schooling.
Yeah.
And Christian formation is more than sending your kids to church. There has to be an owner. Microphone number 2.
Hi. You can probably see I'm wearing a rainbow stole. So my question is, since the church has hurt some of us so much, although there have been wonderful, wonderful individuals and whatever, how do you keep us excited about being a part of the church, and what hope do you give us and our children?
When the church has hurt somebody.
Yeah. First, I'm sorry. And I think that it is not an overstatement to say that young people are far more sensitive to the particularly groups of people that have been hurt by the church than many of us are, who have gotten used to thinking about these as issues. This is a hospitality issue for young people, and specifically if I'm talking about gay and lesbian welcome in the church. I think you're going to hear my opinion here. I think we are in serious danger of losing a generation if we do not get this under wraps in terms of, allowing the church to be a place of welcome for all people. Everybody means everybody. But because everybody means everybody, we can't afford just to lop off a left arm in order to keep the right arm, right? So we have got to figure this out. And by we, I mean adults. And I'm speaking more of my students than I'm talking about you guys, because I don't know where you guys are on this. But my students look at the United Methodist Church and go, I don't know whether that's where I want to put my energy right now. It's kind of a mess. Now, all churches are a mess all the time, right? They still have to figure that out. But in terms of welcome, that feels like a no-brainer to young people. We can figure things out if we can just welcome people into our midst and get everybody in the same room together. And that's something that they have not seen. So I think that we're in danger of losing a lot of people for whom gay, lesbian issues should just not be the hill the church dies on. There are way many other things that feel like they've got more of a mandate for our time than excluding certain people. But like I said, the other part of that is if everybody means everybody, we are on this train together, and we want not to decouple some cars along the way.
My observation on that is that just as the CCOM let the youth determine these things, that I see that social change is often in categories that the boomers want, and they want to impose those on younger people, and younger people decide those in different ways. It's an interesting kind of thing. For example, I go to a lot of groups now of the United Methodist Church where somebody is monitoring who speaks and who doesn't, and at the end will give a report. Well, we had so many white males and so many white females and so many Hispanics and so forth. And I see the young people like, why are we doing this? We walk in and we say, is this diverse? And if it's not, we walk out. It's like new wine needs new wineskins, and the social politicians from the civil rights and the Vietnam and so forth think that want a legal or legislative solution are really inhibiting younger generations that said, look, let us live, let us be like that garden, rather than trying to change the fences with win and lose. So as they watch us, I think it's when the radical right got into politics, a lot of the studies, I believe, show that people backed away from Christianity because between the Roman Catholic scandals and the radical right connection of Christianity and politics for power issues, young people said, I don't want part of that, and they backed away from all denominational participation. Is that what you read?
I think that some of you're right. As the older we get, the harder our categories become. We don't mean for them to be, but it's like, our bones, they get calcified, right? So we get stuck And one of the things that is so important, you know, Benedict said back in the 4th century, he said that the youngest monks needed to be at every decision-making meeting they ever had. The youngest monks were 11 and 12 years old. Because Benedict said, God often reveals what is better to the younger. And there's plenty of scripture stories that'll back that one up. So, you know, for us to be able to continue this conversation across generations is going to be really important. But that means it has to be significant representation across generations. I don't think we're going to be helped by boomers making these calls. And yeah.
Microphone number 5, and this has to be the last one. I said 5. I know some of you want to talk, but this is a great conversation. Microphone number 5.
Just one personal favor. Could you hand out notes on your thing? I couldn't write fast enough. But what would you do? This is a very personal question, so I don't know if anybody else can relate to it. But what would you advise a church and a family that is completely faithful, 100% attends church, wants to share your values and your views with one person in your family who happens to be a youth, and that person is a good person, a moral person, but just doesn't believe in God?
Yeah. That you have just described my son, by the way. So I say that because I'm in this with you. There is a big part of me that thinks our words, particularly if they live with us, they've heard all the words we got, you know. I'm kind of to the point where I think that in this case, I think talking about our faith is hugely important, and being able to use religious words, that's a whole different lecture. But in this case, the life I live has to be my witness, right? Because what people are not all that sure about what they believe. Even we're not all that sure about what we believe, right? We can be faithful and come to it, but you know, we've got our blind spots and our doubts too. But we're pretty sure about who we love and about who loves us. And so that part has to be without a doubt, that this person who loves Jesus loves me. And I don't know how to make sense out of that, but I'm going to have to spend my whole life thinking about that. You know, here's a story I tell them, and I'll shut up. When I talk about people sharing what they love and not just what they know, and a lot of people say gardening and, you know, sewing or whatever. And my dad shared with me, for no good reason except he loved them, White Castle hamburgers. You're from Ohio, you know what these are. And so when I was a kid, we used to go, he'd take me to work with him in Columbus, and I was like 5 or 6, and I thought he loved to take me to work. Of course, now I know it was a babysitting strategy, but at the time, I was all over going to work with my dad. And on the way home, we would stop at a White Castle every time, and he'd buy a little bag of sliders, and we'd sit in the front seat of the car, and we would talk, and we would eat those hamburgers, and then we would go home. Okay, my dad has been dead for 20-some years. I never pass a White Castle outlet. Even though I don't like those hamburgers anymore, I never pass a White Castle without remembering those days with my dad, and without remembering how good it felt to be loved by him. And you know, I think the young people that we have, we just don't know whether they will ever have the faith that we want them to have. We don't know what God is doing in them now that may be dormant for years. We just don't know. This is the nature of youth ministry. You sow seeds you will never harvest. In a lot of ways, this is the nature of parenting. But I think we'd be a whole lot closer if every time a young person passed a church, they would remember what it was like to be loved by this community of people who said they were trying to follow Jesus. You know, maybe that just moves the ball down the field. I'm in Ohio, I can use football metaphors. Maybe we move the ball down the field just a little bit if we start there.
Well, let's express our appreciation one more time to Kenda. Friends, it's not in the agenda, but we need a break. And we've got a powerful thing. So we're gonna take a 15-minute break, and we're gonna start immediately in 15 minutes. And we'll start singing in about 5. So take a break, stretch, we'll start singing, and we'll begin immediately in 15 minutes with Bishop Huey.